They're both small humanoid creatures, they both live in villages, and they both align with white and green in Magic the Gathering. So the question is, are Kithkin Hobbits? Welcome back, my name is Ben, I'm the librarian, and today we are talking about whether or not Kithkin and Hobbits are the same things. Now, if you don't know, Kithkin are a race of small humanoid creatures in Magic the Gathering, and Hobbits are a race of small humanoid creatures in Middle-earth. So there's a lot that's similar about them, and the question is, are they the same or should they be the same? So let's talk about three terms first. So basically the first term is Hobbit. Now Hobbit originates with The Hobbit, the book by J.R.R. Tolkien, and that's the first time that appears, and really Hobbits are exclusive to Middle-earth. There's a whole lot of debate, even within Tolkien's own writings, about the origin of the name Hobbit and where it came from. But they are really exclusive to Middle-earth. There's another term called Halfling, and Halfling really does originate with Lord of the Rings. It's not used in The Hobbit, but Halfling is not considered trademarked by the Tolkien estate, and it is used other places. Most notably, Dungeons and Dragons uses Halflings as one of their races, and so Halflings have been used more widely than Hobbit, mostly because of this trademark issue. The third term is Kithkin, and Kithkin is the term used for these small humanoids in Magic the Gathering. And they've appeared in several sets, but they are most notably known in Lorwyn and Shadowmoor. So this debate has been reignited again now because Lorwyn Eclipsed recently came out. That's a new set in Magic the Gathering. So Kithkin and Hobbits, they seem very similar. The interesting thing now that's different about when this has come out before is when Kithkin were out before, there weren't really Hobbits in Magic the Gathering. But with the release of the Lord of the Rings Universes Beyond 3 years ago, and of course the upcoming Hobbit release coming up later this year, there are Hobbits in Magic the Gathering, but they are all classified as Halflings. Halflings were really introduced into Magic the Gathering as a very small type in the Dungeons and Dragons set, but they became a much larger type in the Lord of the Rings set for obvious reasons. Whereas Kithkin had basically been there on their own for a long time, even though people had always kind of identified them as Halflings or Hobbits. So let's take a look at this. How close are they really, and does it even matter? Well, the main reason that it matters for Magic the Gathering players is because you can't play a typal Halfling deck with Kithkin and Halflings. You could of course play them together because they overlap a lot in color, but you couldn't have them buff each other on a typal level because the buffs that Kithkin are giving the other Kithkin aren't going to come over onto Halflings, and Halflings aren't going to get benefited for there being Kithkin out there. So this is a question that is important if it did affect play. If Wizards of the Coast had decided to turn Kithkin into Halflings so that they could play with Hobbits, that would have been a big deal because it would have really changed the way that the decks could play. At a more philosophical level, it's just a question of, well, are these kinds of creatures present in Magic the Gathering and in Lord of the Rings? Because there are a lot of creatures that are, right? Goblins and orcs, elves and min, of course, being very notable. Also dragons and giants and all kinds of other things, because Tolkien is the foundation of modern fantasy, and so much of what comes from fantasy now originated with Tolkien. And the really weird thing about that typal thing is that within Lorwyn and Lorwyn Eclipsed and Shadowmoor, there is another race, boggarts, that are actually classified as goblins. So they have a different name in Lorwyn. They aren't called goblins, but they are classified as goblins so that they can play in goblin typal decks. So it's like, well, why don't the halfling creatures also get to be Halflings? So like I said, this debate has gone on actually for quite a while, and there are actually sources on the internet saying that it actually goes back to that copyright thing that we talked about earlier. There was actually a plan, according to sources, that they were going to call the Kithkin Hobbits in the original sets where they came out. But due to trademark law, they couldn't, of course, and this was long before anybody even conceived of there being a Lord of the Rings set in Magic the Gathering. So they couldn't use that term, but they didn't use the term Halfling. They chose to use the term Kithkin instead, and that's interesting because they could have used the term Halfling, but Kithkin gives it more of its own flavor within kind of the Lorwyn, Shadowmoor, and of course they've been in some other planes as well. Now the problem with this source about knowing whether or not they actually were going to be called hobbits originally, which would kind of put to rest this whole idea, we could just say, yes, they are supposed to be the halfling characters, is that I can't find that source on the internet now. If you can, please let me know. I would love to know about it. But many places on the internet are claiming this idea that they were going to be hobbits and they just had to change the name. Why they didn't go with halflings? It's hard to know, but it does seem to be mostly focused around flavor. So let's look at whether or not these two types are really even close to each other. Besides the obvious physical similarities, how close are they? Well, one source that I was able to dig up on the Internet Archive is the Lorwyn Player's Guide. So this is kind of where Kithkin were described. And let's see what it says here. It says about Kithkin: valiant, cooperative, superstitious. Now, I think those are all things that you could probably say about hobbits, although the superstitious part, not nearly so much. And the valiant only really shows up when they are put in a pinch, right? Gandalf says that Bilbo is fierce as a dragon in a pinch. And that valiancy really does show up. And in a lot of magic cards, it shows up because most of the Hobbit cards in the Lord of the Rings set are based around those hobbits who either went on an adventure or the hobbits who were defending the Shire in the Scouring of the Shire. So you do see that valiancy show up a lot in the cards. Cooperative, yes, hobbits do tend to be pretty cooperative. Superstitious, not so much. You don't see a lot of superstition among the hobbits. So those are the three qualities that are listed. Let's read what it says. These small-statured meadowfolk build their roads and villages far away from the eyes of others, preferring to keep their simple ways to themselves. Now that aligns very much with hobbits. Hobbits like to be out of the way of the big people. They don't want the big people to bother them, and they don't really want to see them. Then it goes on. It says community and thought weft. Kithkin's minds are woven together into a communal empathy called thought weft. Thought weft is the foundation of their society, and cooperation is key to their efficiency in battle. All right, this is where it starts to break down a little bit. The hobbits don't have anything like a thought weft. They don't have any kind of a hive mind where they come together, and they really don't go to battle. The Scouring of the Shire, that's basically it. Well, so the Kithkin, really, they have all of these cards that are soldier subclasses, and hobbits, the halflings in the Lord of the Rings set, they don't really have that. They are much more likely to have citizen or peasant cards. It's a little bit different there, and especially this mind meld thing that the Kithkin do, really not part of Hobbit culture. And then it says Clachan and Sen. A Kithkin village is known as a Clachan, and each Clachan is led by a Sen, a Kithkin leader similar to a town mayor. Okay, so hobbits, they do live in villages, and they do have a mayor, but they only have one mayor. They don't have a mayor per village. They have one mayor for the entire Shire. So it's a little bit different, but they are organized similarly into this village structure. It goes on to say superstition. Kithkin traditions revolve around a system of simple folk beliefs and superstitions. Some have a basis in history, medicine, or other practical truths, but even the complete fabrications are followed faithfully. So that's where the superstition thing, just not really something that we read about hobbits having a lot of. They aren't doing a lot of superstitious things, but they are a fairly simple folk, right? They are not living in a complex society. So I think looking at this, and it's fairly simple, right? Because we don't get as much lore from Magic the Gathering as we might get from something like the Lord of the Rings. So we don't necessarily see as much about the Kithkin. There is, of course, a lot from the flavor text on the cards and things like that we can kind of glean. But looking at it, I'd say almost certainly Kithkin are based on hobbits, because hobbits are really the beginning of this halfling idea, and Kithkin seem to fulfill a halfling role here. They're almost certainly based on them, but they diverge pretty far. If you look at the types of cards that they have, Kithkin tend to have things like soldiers, clerics, wizards, and knights. Those are things that hobbits are specifically not. They don't do those things. Hobbit cards tend to be citizens, peasants, nobles, and rogues, and those tend to be it. Now, there are some Kithkin rogues, but there aren't a lot of them, and hobbits are expressly said to not really have any magic about themselves, so you wouldn't have hobbit wizards except normal everyday magic, which is what makes them good at being thieves. So I think there's a big divergence, and in terms of that thought weft culture, we really don't have that in the Hobbit, and so I'd say that the primary thing that Magic the Gathering kind of focuses on with the Kithkin, particularly the Kithkin in Lorwyn and Shadowmoor, is not present in the Hobbit. So they've diverged pretty far apart. The only other piece of evidence I would cite here is there is some early concept art floating around the internet for Kithkin that actually had them look more like rats that were kind of walking around on two legs, more humanoid rats. Of course, that's not what hobbits are at all, and so maybe there were, even in the initial concepts, not an idea that they would be kind of these halfling creatures. Now, does it matter for gameplay? Would it be good to try and combine these together? Well, having more in a type is always better if you're playing typal decks. And if you think about it, Kithkin are going up against things like elves and goblins, and those types are massive. There are so many of them. So it would probably help if they could be together, but I don't know just how well they would play together. They are both white and green primarily. So white is really strong in the Kithkin. White and green are both strong in the Hobbits halflings, but there are cards from both of these creature types that also go into blue on the Kithkin side and black on the Hobbit side, and there's a couple red cards, but mostly their colors overlap and they could play well together, and they could potentially play well together even without sharing a type. Both of them do have life gain capabilities, but the Hobbits almost exclusively focus around food. Food is really the primary thing, and of course that is the big thing of Hobbit culture, whereas the Kithkin, there's nothing said with them about food. They don't generate food tokens, and their life gain tends to come from other means, like being able to tap creatures or have creatures enter the battlefield. Okay, so with all that kind of in mind, from a gameplay perspective, maybe it would have been better for them to be halflings. From a flavor perspective, it's probably not. The Kithkin probably need to stand on their own, and I think that some old Magic players really appreciate that because they don't like to see universes beyond invading Magic so much. In the sum total, I think it's probably good that they aren't the same, although there are a lot of similarities, and it is fun to look at them. Now, I want to hear from you. Drop down in the comments and tell me what you think about this. Do you think that Kithkin are halflings and the same as hobbits, or do you think they're different? I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say in the comments, and if you want to speculate more on what's going to happen in the Hobbit Magic the Gathering set, I have a number of videos in this playlist right here that you can go ahead and check out. Until next time, farewell wherever you fare. May your ears receive you at your journey's end.